Welcome to this explainer brought to you by Forge College. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating architectural quirk of the Solana Virtual Machine. We're looking at how the multi-instruction nature of Solana transactions creates some incredibly unique and honestly pretty clever control flow vulnerabilities. If you're coming over from the Ethereum world, you're definitely going to want to pay close attention to this mindset shift. The rules of the game? Yeah, they are completely different here when we talk about composing instructions.
Building right off our previous lesson on CPI and account validation risks, we'll be looking at a literal heist schematic today. We'll hit the SVM instruction gap, map out the anatomy of the exploit, actually build the heist, inspect the logs, secure the vault, and wrap up with key security takeaways. Let's just dive right in.
Section 1. The SVM instruction gap. To really understand this heist, we first need to understand the architecture of the vault doors we're trying to break into.
Okay, let's look at this architectural comparison inked out here. In Ethereum, the EVM execution is basically one big atomic block. You call a smart contract, it locks the global state, runs its logic, and finishes. It all happens in one continuous breath. Safe, predictable, but sequential. Now over in Solana, the SVM is built from the ground up for massive parallel performance. Because of that, a transaction is an array, a composed sequence of distinct individual instructions. Think of it like this. The EVM is like eating a sandwich in one giant bite. The SVM? It's like making a sandwich, setting it down on the counter, turning your back for a second to grab a napkin, and someone swaps your peanut butter for hot sauce before you actually take the bite. The state can absolutely change right between those steps.
And that perfectly illustrates our first core concept on the blueprint: delayed validation. This happens when a program checks a condition, an invariant, early on in its logic, but waits to act on it until later. Because Solana processes instructions sequentially within that single transaction array, it creates a gap, that turning your back moment. This gap, right between when validations run and when other programs act, is the exact open window an exploiter needs to, well, inject their hot sauce.
Section 2. Anatomy of the exploit. Let's meet the oblivious guards and the accomplices who actually take advantage of this open window.
So, the exploit usually hinges on something we call a liability transfer pattern, which is really just a fancy way of saying, wait, I thought you locked the door. It's shifting the responsibility of enforcing a security check to another program, or assuming a later on-chain check will just handle it. A program assumes another instruction is guarding the vault, but because they aren't bound together atomically, no one actually turns the key. You know, developers transitioning from the EVM often get lulled into a false sense of security here. They assume that once a check passes, the state is locked down and totally safe for the rest of the transaction. Spoiler alert, it's not.
Let's map out our heist crew. We've got the payer funding the op, and the target account acting as our vault. But the real stars this show are the programs themselves. We have our vulnerable program acting as the completely oblivious guard. It does an unsafe update, maybe leaving an account in a partially validated state just to save on compute overhead. Then, waiting in the wings, is the helper program. This is our accomplice. It executes right after the guard turns away, leveraging that transient state to just run off with the funds.
Moving to Section 3. Building the heist. Theory is great and all, but let's actually build this exploit so you can see exactly how it ticks under the hood.
To see this in action, we'd set up a local simulated transaction using a standard TypeScript payload, chaining together three very specific steps. First, we prep the account. Just a basic system transfer to get things rolling. Second, we trigger the vulnerable program. This program checks its invariant and writes a partial state. Crucially, it thinks the transaction is completely safe because the developer mistakenly assumed that the invariant checked in step 1 just magically persists through step 3. Third, we immediately call the helper program right behind it, all within the exact same transaction block. Now the critical point is this. The exploit depends entirely on the vulnerable program's validation not being atomic. The trick here is that the vulnerable program assumes a reality that the helper program can silently change before the overall transaction actually wraps up. Since both instructions are packed into one transaction, the SVM just executes them back to back without halting. The vulnerable program says, yep, looks good, and the helper program swoops in a microsecond later, changes the state, and the whole transaction gets committed to the blockchain as a perfectly valid sequence. Crazy, right?
Section 4. Inspecting the logs. Let's roll the security footage and check out the local validator logs to see the exact moment the heist goes down.
If we open up our validator logs, the whole story plays out line by line. Vuln program gets invoked first. It runs its checks, and boom, we see it emit partial underscore state underscore set equals true. It basically left the door unlocked and walked away.
Literally, the very next log line is helper program invoke 2. The accomplice steps right in, sees that partial state marker, and executes helper underscore mutated target. The logs show the vulnerable program writing a partial state marker, followed immediately by the helper program executing an exploitative mutation, caught right on tape.
When we compare these outcomes, the real-world impact is pretty stark. In the vulnerable flow, the target account state is permanently changed without authorization. The attacker wins, the transaction succeeds. Whereas, if we implement a properly mitigated flow, the transaction fails early with an explicit error. The invariant check catches the inconsistency and blocks the mutation, completely aborting the whole transaction before any lasting damage can even be finalized.
Section 5. Securing the vault. So how do we actually fix this blueprint? How do we keep the hot sauce out of our sandwich and the exploiters out of our protocol?
Well, it all comes down to this absolute cardinal rule of SVM security. The locus of enforcement must match the locus of authority. Let that sink in for a second. If you are authorizing an action, you must enforce the security of that action in the exact same place. Don't rely on assumptions about external program behavior. And definitely don't assume that just because an invariant was mathematically sound at instruction 1, it's still going to be true by instruction 3.
Let's look at some practical solutions to build a genuinely secure smart contract. You've got 4 really strong options here. First, simply reorder your instructions so the sensitive check covers both actions atomically. Just put the check at the very end of the transaction array so literally nothing slips past it. Second, add explicit checks that assert post conditions, basically double-checking your work after state changes to guarantee no malicious edits happened in the interim. Third, use program-derived addresses, or PDAs, to tightly bind authority to the program itself, so no external instruction can spoof a signature. And fourth, require an additional signer to cryptographically prove intent. Use any of these layer defenses, and you'll stop the heist cold.
Section 6. Key security takeaways. Let's quickly review the main engineering takeaways from this simulated exploit so you can confidently apply this mindset to your own code.
If you take absolutely nothing else away from this, remember these 3 things. 1. Instruction sequencing inside a single SVM transaction defines observability. State changes are actually visible between instructions. 2. Validation is only as strong as its surrounding atomicity. A validation check is utterly, completely useless if a subsequent instruction can legally invalidate it before the transaction actually finishes processing. And 3. Compose your checks to bind authority and validation tightly together at the exact moment of execution.
Which brings us to a critical question to ponder before our next lesson. How might these simple control flow gaps scale into massive decentralized protocol hacks? I mean, when you start stacking complex DeFi Legos, these tiny gaps become gaping security holes. We'll be looking at real-world protocol misuse patterns next time. To learn more about this and other Web3 topics, be sure to visit forge.college. Thanks for joining me on this explainer by Forge College, and I will catch you in the next one.